When the snow blanketed the fields, most farmers saw it as a barrier, but one Amish farmer saw it as a challenge. His crazy design for a winter plow, laughed at by neighbors, would soon become the very thing that saved crops, livelihoods, and even the town itself. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of hard work, faith, and innovation speak to you, join us for tomorrow's tale. Winter had always been the same for most farmers in Lancaster County. The first snowflakes would fall, and then the fields would lie dormant, untouched by the passing of time. For Jacob Lapp, this was a season of forced rest, a time to repair, reflect, and prepare for the year ahead. But when the first snow of 1,854 fell in early December, Jacob found himself restless. The fields were buried under a thick blanket of white, and while the other farmers were content to wait for spring, Jacob's mind could not settle. He was already known for his peculiar ways, building things with a quiet precision that only he understood. His barn was a testament to his craft. Its doors slid as smoothly as the evening sun across the sky, and his barn roof was a feat of structure that others could only marvel at in passing. But his latest obsession was different, a plow that could handle the weight of snow, cut through the frozen earth, and still leave behind perfectly tilled rows for the coming spring planting. "I've never seen anything like it, Jacob," his brother Eli had said one evening, watching him drag a wooden sled through the snow. "What on earth is this?" Jacob wiped the sweat from his brow despite the chill in the air. "It's something new," he replied. "A way to get through the fields no matter the weather." The concept was simple in Jacob's mind, but wild to others. He had noticed the tires of sleds were often reinforced with metal for winter travel. So why couldn't the same principle be applied to plows? The snow, which once stopped the farmer's progress, could be cleared with a device that could both slide and dig into the ground. And so, Jacob spent the next days in his workshop, the smell of freshly sawed wood mingling with the cold night air. With metal reinforcements along the wooden sled frame, wheels designed to break through the thickest snow, and a blade sharp enough to cut through frozen soil, Jacob was certain his design would work. It was a new kind of plow, one that could clear the winter fields and till the earth before the frost had even melted. The only question was whether it would be accepted or laughed off like all his other unconventional ideas. The days leading up to Christmas were cold and still. Jacob had finished his plow just in time to meet the first heavy snowfall of the season. He stood by his barn, staring at the fields. The land was deep in snow, untouched, silent under the winter's grip. He felt the familiar weight of doubt settle on his chest. What if he had been wrong? What if the ground was too frozen? What if the plow was a mistake? His wife, Sarah, stepped out of the house, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She came to stand beside him, her eyes soft yet steady. "You're thinking too much, Jacob," she said quietly, her breath a cloud in the cold air. "If it's meant to work, it will work." Jacob nodded, trying to quell the doubt that kept creeping in. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this felt different. He could hear the murmurs of the neighbors already. "Too risky. It's too much wood, too much iron. This will never work, not for the winter." He could already picture their faces when the snow hit. They'd laugh at his expense. But then, something stirred within him. A quiet resolve, honed through years of patience and faith. The ground had never been kind to farmers, but they had always found a way. He would not let the earth or the snow stop him. Jacob placed his hand on the wooden handles of the plow, feeling the rough grain beneath his fingers. The sled was heavy, but it was built with purpose. He took a deep breath and pushed it forward. The metal-tipped wheels rolled easily at first, skimming over the snow. The plow blade followed closely behind, breaking the surface, carving a clear path through the thick snow. He turned the plow, and it followed, digging deeper into the frozen earth. Jacob smiled as the blade cut through the frozen ground with ease. The snow was no longer an enemy. It was a canvas, and Jacob was the artist. Each row was straight and true. As the plow moved forward, the snowy path it left behind grew wider, and the soil began to show its fertile depth beneath. This was the moment Jacob had prayed for. The plow worked. It was more than just a tool. It was the answer to a problem that had stumped the farm community for years. A way to keep the fields productive, even in the harshest of winters. The first test of faith had been passed. But what would the neighbors say? As Jacob pushed the plow across the snow-covered field, he knew it wasn't just the earth he had to prove it to. It was the people, the ones who would either embrace or reject this new way of doing things. And in that moment, he was prepared for whatever came next. By mid-January, the word of Jacob Lapp's plow spread across Lancaster County like wildfire. What had started as a quiet invention in the corner of his barn was now the talk of every farmer's dinner table. At first, the whispers were cautious, tinged with disbelief. "Did you hear about Jacob Lapp's plow? They say it works in the snow, but—" Some dismissed it as just another one of Jacob's eccentric ideas, while others were curious enough to see for themselves. It was late one afternoon when a group of farmers, led by Eli, Jacob's brother, arrived at the Lapp farm. The cold wind bit at their faces, and the snow had once again covered the fields, but they were determined to witness this plow in action. Jacob stood at the edge of the field, his hands wrapped tightly around the wooden handles, ready to prove the critics wrong. Eli, the first to speak, was skeptical but willing to watch. "Jacob," he called out as he approached, "we've heard a lot about this, but I reckon it's time to see it for ourselves. Show us what you've done." Jacob, his face weathered from the harsh winter, nodded without a word. He motioned for the others to step back and began to push the plow forward, the sled cutting into the snow with ease. The sound of the metal scraping against the earth was steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat pulsing through the cold. One by one, the farmers stood silently, watching as the plow carved a path. The snow piled up on either side, revealing the brown earth beneath. Jacob turned the plow and started again, his movements fluid and deliberate. Eli watched closely, his arms folded across his chest. He was trying to find any flaw, any crack in the design that could prove this was, as he had expected, a fool's errand. But after a few moments he couldn't deny the simplicity of it. The plow was cutting through the snow, the earth beneath showing no signs of struggle. It was working. "I'll be damned," Eli said quietly, almost to himself. "It's working." Jacob paused, wiping his brow, and turned to face the group. "I told you it would," he said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet pride. The farmers, initially skeptical, now moved closer, their eyes wide with surprise and admiration. "How did you do it?" one of them asked. Jacob smiled, his hands still steady on the plow. "It's all in the design. I used what we already know, what's been done for centuries, just a little different, a little better." Eli nodded slowly, taking it all in. "Well, I'll say this much. It's the best damn thing I've seen in a long while." The others murmured in agreement, and soon they were all helping Jacob, taking turns with the plow, testing its strength, watching it as it moved with grace through the snow. It was no longer just Jacob's invention, it had become something that could change the way they farmed in winter, something that could keep them moving forward even when the seasons were against them. As the sun began to set, the farmers left Jacob's field with their minds buzzing. This was a breakthrough, a true innovation born from necessity. The quiet whispers turned into discussions, and soon it became clear that Jacob's plow would soon be replicated across Lancaster County. But for Jacob, it wasn't about the praise. It was about proving that faith in his work, his perseverance, and his love for the land could overcome any obstacle. By the time February arrived, the world outside Jacob's farm had shifted. The once unseen snowplow had now become a staple of Lancaster's winter landscape. What was once met with doubt was now accepted and sought after. Neighbors began to borrow the design, eager to see if it could work for them. It wasn't long before Jacob found himself not only maintaining his farm but helping his neighbors modify their own plows to match his design. But with the influx of interest came a new challenge, one that Jacob hadn't expected. While he had always preferred the quiet solitude of his land, his newfound role as an innovator forced him into the public eye. The small barn that had once housed his inventions was now filled with visitors, farmers looking for advice, neighbors hoping to improve their own machinery, and even those who simply wanted to see the man who had done the impossible. Jacob worked tirelessly, poring over designs, making small adjustments, and helping each farmer who came to him. He became a mentor of sorts, guiding others through the process, sharing his knowledge. It wasn't long before he realized that he wasn't just creating plows anymore, he was helping create a community of farmers who believed in thinking differently, working harder, and having faith that things could improve, even when it seemed impossible. But the rise in attention also came with its own set of struggles. Jacob's brother Eli, who had always been his closest ally, started to feel the weight of the situation. He was used to working with Jacob on the farm, managing the day-to-day tasks and keeping things running smoothly. But now, Jacob seemed to be more focused on his plow than ever before. There were fewer conversations over dinner, fewer moments spent together in the barn. Eli couldn't help but feel a slight strain between them. "Jacob," he said one evening, as they stood by the fire in the barn, "you're building something important, but don't forget about the farm. Don't forget about us." Jacob, standing with his hands on the workbench, paused. His eyes softened as he turned to face his brother. "I haven't forgotten," he said quietly. "But sometimes, Eli, something bigger than the farm comes along. And when it does, you can't ignore it. This plow, it's more than just wood and metal. It's about survival. It's about the future." Eli nodded, though he still felt the quiet ache of loss in his chest. He understood Jacob's drive, but he also knew that the land they worked was just as important as the invention Jacob had created. And so, despite the whirlwind of change around him, Jacob never lost sight of what mattered most. He would continue to build, to teach, and to innovate, but he would also remain rooted in the land that had always provided. Together, with his brother and his community, Jacob would continue to plow through the snow both literally and figuratively. By early March, the snow began to soften under the warming sun. Jacob Lapp's plow had not only survived the winter but had begun to change the way the land was worked. The fields were opening up once again, and as spring approached, Jacob found himself standing at the edge of his farm, watching the thawing earth. The innovation that had started as a solitary dream was now a part of every farmer's daily life. Jacob's quiet pride grew with each passing day, as the fields he worked and the lives he touched flourished. But with this success came an unexpected challenge. As the community's dependence on his plow grew, Jacob felt the strain of being the central figure in what had become a small revolution. More than just a tool, the plow had become a symbol of change, a testament to innovation, hard work, and the courage to question the way things had always been done. Jacob was at his workbench, making minor adjustments to the plow when his brother Eli entered the barn. The two had been growing closer in the months since Jacob's invention took hold, but there was still something unspoken between them, a quiet distance that lingered whenever they spoke of the future. "Jacob," Eli began, his voice steady but serious, "we've built something great. The plow works, the neighbors are happy, but I'm beginning to wonder if we've lost sight of the simple things, the farm, the animals, the seasons. It feels like we're chasing something bigger now, something that might change everything." Jacob looked up from the plow, his hands steady on the tools. He saw the concern in Eli's eyes, the same concern that had been there since they'd first set foot on this land. "I haven't forgotten," Jacob said quietly. "The farm, our life here, it's always been the foundation of everything, but this plow, it's just a tool, a way to work with the seasons, not against them. And if it helps others, if it can make things easier, then we've done more than just survive." Eli leaned against the wall, his face shadowed by doubt. "And what happens when the seasons change again? When the work becomes too much, too fast? Are we going to lose ourselves in what we've built?" Jacob sighed, setting down the tool. He walked toward his brother, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Eli, this isn't just about us. It's about everyone who works this land. The plow, the fields, the work, it's all part of something bigger than us. But I promise, we won't forget the small things. We can't. The land will always come first." Eli looked into his brother's eyes and nodded slowly. "I hope you're right." Jacob stood still for a moment, his gaze moving over the horizon. There was more to come, more challenges, more seasons to weather, but Jacob knew that with his faith in the land and his faith in those around him, they would continue to grow, continue to innovate, and continue to build something that could stand the test of time. As the years passed, Jacob Lapp's plow became more than just a tool, it became a legacy. What had once been a solitary dream built in a quiet barn was now something that defined the land, the community, and the families who worked it. The snowplow that Jacob had built had become the standard. Farmers from neighboring counties came to Lancaster to see the plow in action, to learn the design, and to carry it back with them to their own fields. But as Jacob stood in his barn on a crisp winter morning, watching the snow fall softly outside, he realized that the true legacy of the plow was not just in its design or in the fields it helped to plow. It was in the way it had changed the way people thought about their work. It had reminded them that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about adapting. About finding new ways to meet the challenges of the land, to work with the seasons, and to embrace the future without losing sight of the past. Jacob's mind drifted to his brother Eli, who had taken over much of the farm's daily work, allowing Jacob the freedom to focus on the growing demand for his plows. Though the farm had grown over the years, and their land had expanded, Eli had remained a steady, grounding force for Jacob. The two men, bound by family and by faith, had found balance between the old ways and the new. And through their work, they had shown the community that change could be a good thing if it was built with care and respect. One evening, as the winter began to give way to the early signs of spring, Jacob stood before the barn, his eyes scanning the snow-covered fields. He was no longer the young man who had first carved the path through the snow with his crazy design. His hair had grayed, and the lines of age had settled on his face, but his heart was as strong as ever. His hands, worn from years of labor, had created more than just a plow. They had helped create a future for those who worked the land. His children, now grown, had become a part of the legacy, carrying forward his knowledge, his faith, and his love for the earth. Jacob watched as his son, Eli's eldest, worked in the field, the plow cutting through the snow with the same steady rhythm Jacob had once dreamed of. Eli approached, his breath visible in the cold air. He placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You've done more than you realize, Jacob. This land, this community, they're all better for what you've done. We're better for it." Jacob nodded, a quiet smile spreading across his face. "It was never about me, Eli. It was about all of us. This land, this work, it's a gift. And as long as we keep working together, it'll keep giving." The two men stood together, side by side, as the last of the snow began to melt away, revealing the promise of a new season. And in that quiet moment, Jacob Lapp knew that his plow, his faith, and his dedication had become more than just a part of the land. It had become a part of the future, a legacy that would carry on long after the winter had passed. As Jacob walked back to the barn, he knew that the work was never truly finished. There would always be more to learn, more to build, and more to do. But for now, he was content. The plow had done its work. The fields were ready. And the future, like the land, was ready to be shaped once more. As the years turned, Lancaster County was forever changed by the legacy of Jacob Lapp's plow. What began as one farmer's stubborn belief that things could be different had evolved into a movement that reshaped farming practices across the region. Jacob's design, which had once been dismissed as impractical, had now become a symbol of resilience, innovation, and faith. By the time spring arrived each year, the fields were never more than a few days away from being worked. The winter plow that Jacob had crafted was no longer just a tool, it had become a tradition, something handed down from one generation to the next. Farmers from distant places came to witness Jacob's creation in action. They marveled at how the design worked, not only through the snow but also in the muddy, early spring earth. It was the ultimate testament to Jacob's ingenuity, a tool designed for winter but suited to all the seasons. Jacob had never sought recognition. He preferred to remain in the background, quietly doing his part to help others. However, as the years went on, his name became synonymous with the plow, and eventually, even his humble barn became a place of pilgrimage for those looking to learn. One particular winter, a young man named Caleb arrived from a neighboring county. He had heard of Jacob's plow and seen the success it had brought to Lancaster County. Caleb had recently inherited a small farm from his father, but he was struggling. The farm was small and lacked the resources of larger operations, and Caleb found himself at a crossroads. He had little time or money for innovative designs, but he knew that in order to make a living, he would need to do things differently. Jacob had already been through this same uncertainty in his younger years. He saw something in Caleb, a determination that mirrored his own. He welcomed the young man into his barn and began to show him the ropes. The lessons were simple: how to assess the land, how to adapt the plow design to meet his specific needs, and most importantly, how to trust the work. Jacob explained that it wasn't about being perfect, it was about being persistent. Through the careful application of faith and innovation, Caleb could overcome the challenges ahead. Caleb spent the following weeks in Lancaster, working with Jacob, learning the methods and the mindset that had brought success to the county. He returned to his farm that spring, armed with a newfound understanding. When the snow came the following winter, Caleb used Jacob's plow to work his own fields for the first time. It wasn't just the land he had transformed, it was his approach to farming itself. With patience, perseverance, and the right tools, Caleb found that even the most difficult challenges could be overcome. Back in Lancaster, Jacob continued to work with his neighbors, never looking for accolades or praise, just quietly leading the way forward. And in time, it wasn't just Jacob's plow that was changing the landscape, it was the very spirit of innovation and community that he had helped nurture. The once skeptical farmers who had laughed at Jacob's design were now his strongest advocates, each one recognizing the importance of his vision. Together, they worked to shape a future where every farmer, no matter how small their farm or how tough the winter, could thrive. As the years wore on, Jacob grew older, his hair and beard turning silver beneath his hat. His hands, once quick and steady, were now more deliberate, the knuckles gnarled from years of work. But though his body had aged, his spirit remained as strong as ever. The plow he had crafted was still the centerpiece of his life's work, but Jacob knew that time was moving on. He had done all he could with his hands, but the future of the farm and of his family would require more than just an old plow. One evening, in the quiet of the barn, Jacob sat beside his son Eli and his daughter-in-law, Sarah, watching the sun dip below the horizon. They had all gathered that day to discuss the next step. Jacob had taught Eli everything he knew, and Eli, in turn, had passed it down to the next generation. But now, Jacob knew it was time for something more. His grandchildren were growing older, and soon they would take over the farm entirely. It was time for the final lesson. "Eli," Jacob began, his voice quiet but firm, "I've shown you how to work the land, how to trust it, and how to never stop trying. But there's one thing left to teach, and it's something you can't learn from a plow or from the earth. It's about legacy." Eli looked at his father, sensing the weight in his words. "I know, Dad. I know it's time for us to carry it all forward." Jacob nodded slowly. "Legacy is more than just what we build with our hands. It's what we build with our hearts. The plow, the land, the community. It's all part of something much bigger. What we leave behind is the lesson we teach by how we live. You've been with me every step of the way. Now it's your turn to teach your children and their children what it means to work with the earth." Sarah, who had been listening quietly, smiled softly. "You've given us everything we need, Jacob. We'll make sure the farm and everything you've built remains strong." Jacob's eyes softened as he looked at his family, knowing they would continue the work, continue the vision, and continue to share the lessons of patience, faith, and innovation. The plow, the simple tool that had changed everything, was now an heirloom, passed down from father to son, from one generation to the next. As winter came again, Jacob found himself in the barn, working on the plow one final time. It was the same design, the same sturdy frame, and the same sharp blade that had cut through so many winters before. But this time, when Jacob finished his work, he did not just see a tool. He saw a symbol of all he had accomplished: the land, the work, the community, and most of all, the legacy of faith and perseverance. When Jacob passed away in the winter of 1885, the community gathered to mourn, but they also celebrated his life's work. His legacy lived on not just in the plow, but in the way the farmers worked the land together, with patience, innovation, and faith. Eli, his children, and his grandchildren continued to use Jacob's plow, teaching new generations the same lessons Jacob had taught him. The simple, sturdy tool remained the cornerstone of their work, a testament to the quiet strength of a man who had believed that even the hardest winters could be overcome with the right preparation and the right heart. And so, Jacob Lapp's plow continued to carve its path through the fields, long after his hands had let go of the handles. The legacy of his life, the quiet strength, the faith, and the ingenuity remained, woven into the fabric of the land and the people who worked it. As the years passed, Lancaster County settled into a rhythm. The fields cycled through their seasons, as did the people who worked them. And Jacob Lapp's plow became a fixture of the landscape, as familiar as the barns and the quiet roads that led from farm to farm. Yet, even in the steady pulse of farm life, change was inevitable. Jacob's grandchildren, the youngest generation to grow up on the land, had heard the stories of how their grandfather had built the plow and how it had transformed their family and community. They were proud of their heritage, proud of the legacy left behind. But for the first time, the younger ones began to see things a little differently. The world beyond Lancaster was changing. New machines and technologies began to appear, some promising even greater efficiency, some designed to make the work easier. The younger farmers were curious about these new ideas, even as they held tight to the values that had been passed down. Eli's eldest son, Samuel, had grown up with the plow, and now he stood at the threshold of adulthood, ready to take on the farm's responsibilities. He was a thoughtful young man, practical but open-minded. He respected his grandfather's design, but he also knew the future was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. One crisp morning, Samuel found himself standing in the barn, looking at the old plow. He traced his fingers along the worn handles, the metal edges still sharp, the wood still sturdy despite its age. It had served them well for generations, but now he wondered if it could continue to serve them in the years to come. His father, Eli, came in, wiping his brow after a long morning's work. "What are you thinking about, Sam?" "I was thinking about the plow," Samuel said, his voice steady. "About how it's done, everything we've asked of it, and yet, I wonder if it's enough. There are new machines, coming, ones that can do what we've always done but faster. I don't want to forget what Grandpa taught us, but I also want to make sure we're not left behind." Eli placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Your grandfather would have wanted you to do just that, think ahead. But don't forget that the heart of what we do is in the land, not the tools we use. Technology is a tool, just like the plow. But it's the hands that guide it, the heart that leads, and the faith that sustains." Samuel nodded slowly. The path forward would not be simple, but it was his to chart, guided by the lessons of those who had come before him. As he gazed out the barn door toward the fields, he realized that change was not something to fear, it was something to embrace. The seasons continued to change, as did the landscape of Lancaster County. Samuel, Eli's son, grew into his role as the next steward of the farm, guided by the wisdom of his father, grandfather, and the generations before them. Samuel had listened to his father's advice, and though he had considered new methods and tools, he knew that his family's legacy was more than the machines they used. It was the spirit of hard work, faith, and community that would carry them forward. One summer, as Samuel worked the fields with his father, they found themselves standing at the edge of the land, surveying the crops that had grown from the soil his grandfather had tilled so many years ago. The old plow, now aged and worn, sat against the barn, still a reminder of how far they had come. "It's time for a change, Sam," Eli said, his voice low but firm. "The world is different now. The farm is growing, and so is the need for new tools. But don't forget, the land is still the heart of everything. That's where the work begins." Samuel nodded. He understood now. It wasn't about choosing one way over another. It was about honoring what had come before and building upon it. His grandfather had shown them that with hard work, anything was possible, even in the face of adversity. And now, Samuel was ready to lead the next chapter. Together, they brought the old plow back into the fields one last time. It was still functional, still capable of turning the soil with strength and precision. But as they worked, Samuel made a quiet decision. The plow had served them well, but it was time to build something new, something that honored the past and embraced the future. It would be a blend of the old and the new, a tool that could carry their work into the next generation. As the seasons passed, The farm thrived under Samuel's stewardship. He continued to use the plow, but he also introduced modern technology that allowed the land to be worked more efficiently, freeing up time for the family to focus on what truly mattered: community, faith, and family. And as the years went by, Jacob Lapp's legacy remained a guiding light. The plow, once seen as a revolutionary tool, became a symbol of the enduring strength of the land and the people who worked it. Jacob's vision had transformed not just the farm but the entire community, teaching them that the future was not something to be feared, but something to be embraced with faith, patience, and ingenuity. As Samuel stood in the fields one evening, watching the sun set over the land, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. His grandfather's work had endured, and now it was his turn to pass on that legacy to his children. The plow had changed the world around them, but it was the values that Jacob had instilled in them that would endure for generations to come. The legacy was more than just a tool, it was a way of life. And as long as the land remained, so too would Jacob Lapp's legacy.